thanks, Mike, for the introduction, and thanks to Mike and Allegra and Tatum and the First Lab for inviting me here today. Like Mike said, I'm a SOMAS alum, so it's really great to be back here. I won't say how long it's been since I was working with Mike, but it's been a little while. And I'm having this weird kind of this is your life moment with the plenary talks, and kind of people in the audience. I've run into kind of old lab mates and folks I've worked with throughout my career. Some of Kim's pictures, I was like, hey, I was there that day. That picture with the muddy sturgeon, I was on the boat that day. It was one of the coolest things I've ever seen. So it's really great to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about offshore wind. I know Jim talked about this a little bit this morning, but I'm going to talk about offshore wind and what it means for fisheries scientists. So if you're not like me and you don't eat, sleep, breathe, dream offshore wind, whether you want to or not, all day, every day, it's really rapidly expanding in the U.S. It's primarily driven by federal and state renewable energy goals. So you may have heard of 30 by 30. There's two 30 by 30s. There's a kind of conservation 30 by 30, and there's an offshore wind 30 by 30. The 30 by 30 that the offshore wind folks refer to is a 30 gigawatt target by 2030. There's also several really ambitious state renewable energy goals as well too, and for offshore wind, and in this area, in the Mid-Atlantic and southern New England, there's over 28 gigawatts of offshore wind energy goals at the state level. Of that, there's over 12 gigawatts that have been awarded or scheduled, and that actually, I think I pulled that number about a year ago, so it's probably higher than that right now. But all that said, there's only two projects that are currently in the water. One is the Block Island Wind Farm, which is 5 kind of smaller turbines in state waters off of Block Island. That's a 30 megawatt project. And there's two turbines in federal waters in the Seaval project off of Virginia. That's meant to be kind of a demonstration site offshore. There's 2 projects that have their environmental review complete with construction on the way, primarily kind of the cable laying and the onshore construction side of things. That's the Vineyard Wind 1 project in southern New England and the South Fork Wind Farm. And South Fork is one called South Fork because they're landing the cable. Well, part of the reason is because the cables are coming into South Fork, Long Island. That said, these maps here, which are admittedly hard to see, show the massive amount of development that's planned on the East Coast and now starting to be in the West Coast and other areas as well. So every one of those little colored dots is a lease site that at this point has been leased by the federal government, and it's in some stage of the planning process. So even though there's only 2 projects built and 2 projects that are starting to be built, there's probably 10, 15, 20 that are in different stages of development and permitting processes right now. There were 3 lease auctions in 2022. Early in 2022 was a New York Bight lease auction. That went for a record $4.37 billion. It was an unthinkable number in the offshore wind space of what that lease went for. So these are they're hard to see on the map, but the 6 sites kind of in the Bight that are a little bit further offshore, those are the ones that were leased off last year, as well as one that's attached to that little pizza slice up off the Equinor site. There was 2 lease sites in the Carolinas that went for over $300 million, and for the first time ever on the West Coast, 2 lease sites in December that went for $700 million in California. Most of the offshore wind technology, both here in the U.S. as well as in Europe and other places, has been limited by depth. So with the fixed kind of foundation turbines, they're limited to around 60 meters. But there's now exploration of floating technology in the U.S. and Europe. So in the U.S., this is being used either in deeper water or in sometimes kind of rockier substrate. So we're looking at floating wind in the Gulf of Maine on the West Coast, those California leases, those will be floating wind turbines, as well as deeper Atlantic waters. So these are places where the technology is already happening, where the development's already happening, but there's even more on the horizon. So there's areas being explored off of Oregon, Hawaii, that's on the map on the left there, as well as the Gulf of Mexico and what they're calling the Central Atlantic. Those are kind of deep water sites. So it's likely that more areas will be identified and leased in the next 2 to 5 years. So offshore wind is coming fast and furious, and it's something I think that, for folks that are particularly working in offshore marine work, something to start thinking about if you haven't already. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just to be aware, there's a pretty long process at the federal level. So the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, is who handles the the leasing off the offshore. So essentially, they identify blocks of the ocean floor that can be leased for renewable energy. It takes about a year to 2 years to identify those areas. It's a public process that starts with usually a pretty broad area that gets winnowed down over time before it ultimately gets determined with a proposed sale notice for a lease area. Then it goes into a competitive lease. You can literally watch the auction during the day if you're a nerd like me and likes to keep refreshing your browser. It'll show it doesn't show who's bidding, but it shows how much they're bidding in different increments throughout the day. And it was insane to watch the one in New York Bight, one I think over 2 days, maybe even longer, and you just saw those numbers creeping up and creeping up. So then the lease happens, and basically those developers that win those leases have the ability to start planning to build there. And they go through a lengthy federal and state process to build, starting with some pre-survey kind of meetings and plannings. There's one big kind of regulatory step is the SAP, the site assessment plan that gets submitted. Then they start doing some of their surveying, things like that. The next big milestone is what's called the COP, the construction operation plan. They go through all these environmental reviews, and if all goes well, gets approved, and they have kind of a green light to start construction. So all said and done, this timeline takes generally anywhere from 7 to 10 years. So those sites that were just leased off in 2022, you're not going to see them built for a little while because there's a pretty long, lengthy process in the regulatory review. There's some push to speed up this process for various reasons because it does take a while, and it's hard to plan for a project if you start planning at one point and then it doesn't get built until 7 to 10 years later. The technology changes massively, and so it causes real complications of how you actually plan for a project while the technology and the regulations and everything else is advancing at the same time. So what does this mean for fisheries scientists? Why do you care about offshore wind? Why am I up here talking about this? And so to pull a cheesy quote from Spider-Man, and to spin it around, there's a really great challenge in the offshore wind, but it also is providing some really great opportunities in fisheries. We're building a brand new industry here in the US with a lot of uncertainty, but it also is a great chance to do some really good science. So there's lessons learned from Europe and other places where offshore wind has been built and been operating for decades, but we don't necessarily know kind of the impacts in the US. It's different fisheries, different habitats, different oceanography, things like that. And so there's some uncertainty there, and we really need well-designed empirical studies, collaborative research to improve our understanding of what these impacts are on species, on habitats, on ecosystems, and also on socioeconomics. We have as fishery scientists, we know the importance of the fishing industry and making sure that that remains a robust and lively fishery. And this research that we do as scientists also helps inform environmental policy and regulatory process to really support evidence-based decision-making, right? That's central, that we want to make sure we have good scientific evidence to know if there's any of these impacts happening. And in my new role, which I'll talk about in a minute, we start thinking about ways we can use this opportunities for research and technology innovation as we kind of move into this next stage. So there's lots of different research and monitoring tools that are needed as we look at offshore wind. Everything from, kind of guidance documents so that we're all kind of looking at things the same ways, and templates. There's a big push for kind of data management and data sharing and data accessibility. There's a ton of information being collected right now, but it's not necessarily available because a lot of it is funded privately by the offshore wind developers. It doesn't have that requirement of something that's funded with state or federal dollars to make the data available. And so we're kind of wrestling with some of those challenges now. There's clear kind of need for project or issue-specific research and monitoring, things like impacts to species, things like habitat alteration. There's a big interest of the impacts of things like the cold pool here in the Mid-Atlantic. So if you put these structures in the water, how's that going to affect ocean circulation, which then leads to impacts on things like larval transport and things like that as well too. And then from a broader sense, how can we look at kind of integrated monitoring and research innovation? How do we look at cumulative impacts? When these sites are being built all the way up and down the coast, how do we look at cumulatively how they're going to impact our resources? There's some concerns about implications to scientific surveys and what that means for things like stock assessment. So with these turbines in the water, they're big turbines, they're relatively spaced far apart. They're anywhere from 3/4 of a mile to a mile or more apart. But to get the bigelow between them to run the NIMS trawl survey, may not be possible when they're in the water. and looking at things of how can we develop innovative research tools and techniques to improve our research and monitoring. So my former position, I was the director of the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance at ROSA. We worked really closely within the fishing and the offshore wind industry and the regulators on kind of research and monitoring challenges. And we came out with guidance a couple years ago about research and monitoring, and basically it was kind of a recipe of how you do good science. And central to that was this idea that you need to kind of properly design hypothesis-driven studies with clear objectives to address the research needs, which as scientists everyone goes, yeah, well, of course you do that. But what the regulators were seeing was when the developers were submitting their monitoring plans and things like that, it wasn't always clearly defined why they were doing things, or what was the purpose of you doing a trawl survey, or why are you doing a ventless trap survey here, or something like that. And so it was really leaning in on making sure there's clear objectives, clear hypotheses, those type of things. Looking at how things could be integrated in a regional context. So even if you're working on one project in a specific area with a very specific goal, how can we ensure that that's done in a way that can be integrated at a broader scale, either by you or by others or collaborative teams or what have you. And looking at how we can standardize study designs, sampling methods, and data sharing to look at these broader scale impacts. But as we kind of dug into that, we realized that the idea of standardization varied depending on who you were talking to. Some people thought, okay, every survey that goes out should use nearly the same boat with the exact same net design, all the same specifications, fishing the exact same way. That's really difficult to do. So how do we manage those expectations without standardization? Fisheries scientists are great about taking messy data in different ways and putting it together and coming out with some great information, looking at different indices and things like that. So what do we mean by standardization, and how do we manage those expectations? And with all these projects happening and gathering data and doing their monitoring, there's really limited information sharing between projects and researchers on sampling design, methods, gear, how you're analyzing your data, how you're sharing it, those type of things. And so there's many places, particularly in southern New England, where there's several sites and several projects right on top of each other. But a site that's a few miles away from the other may be designing a study completely differently because the PIs are different, they're hired in different ways, and maybe there was different stakeholder concerns one place or the other, and there wasn't a lot of communication going on. And so if you were a state regulator and then you suddenly got 2 monitoring plans to review, you go, well, these are different, I don't understand why. And so, really trying to open the door for those conversations of why we're doing things a different way, and can we make it kind of have better guidance to really do good science with all of this. So with all of this, it means there's been some good opportunities in research funding. There's been a lot of funding that's coming out being dedicated specifically to offshore wind research, and in some cases specifically dedicated to offshore wind research related to fisheries. So at the federal level, there's money coming from BOEM primarily through their environmental studies program. They've funded quite a few studies related to offshore wind, and there's quite a few more on the horizon. The Department of Energy, or DOE, I think it was about 2 years ago, funded some pretty large programs focusing on kind of fisheries and wildlife and offshore wind as well. And NOAA has been funding research as well. So the most recent, I believe, was a co-funding effort in New England between Northeast Fisheries Science Center, the Sea Grant Northeast Consortium, and DOE to fund some kind of socioeconomic studies partially related to offshore wind. There's a fair amount of money coming at the state level. So one thing that's missing from that BOEM diagram I showed was that somewhere in there, someone has to agree to buy that power for the developers to decide to build their project. So there's a competitive state process for the energy offtake. So the developers bid into a competitive RFP process of what they're going to do, how they're going to build, how they're going to address environmental impacts, how they're going to do everything from addressing local communities and equity and justice and things like this as well. And there's been some real power at the state level to use that to advocate for better research and monitoring. So in New York and New Jersey, they've added where the developers are required to allocate $10,000 per megawatt for regional research and monitoring for wildlife and fisheries through their procurement agreements. So the volume of this comes out to about $50 million between New York and New Jersey alone that's being dedicated to the research. Half of that is for fisheries. So there's $25 million just in New York and New Jersey for fisheries-related research in offshore wind. If anyone wants to talk about it, I know those processes well. They're being handled different ways in New York and New Jersey. Some of it's been allocated already in New Jersey. The New York $12.5 million will likely come out an RFP either later this year or early next year. So that is something to really think about that's on the horizon. And there's additional funding anticipated through future procurement agreements in New York and New Jersey and possibly other states that are looking at this model. So New York just closed their third round procurement RFP a couple weeks ago. That included that $10,000 per megawatt condition in there as well. New Jersey's next round of procurement should be coming out relatively soon and is expected to have the same. So probably in another, say, 2 years, maybe even sooner, there'll be another on the order of probably $50 million in the bite for this type of research. It's also had the opportunity to develop some of these regional nonprofits and public-private partnerships. So I am the executive director of the now RDC, the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium. I'll talk about who we are. Don't worry if you haven't heard about us. You're probably not sitting in the space that I am. I'm not offended. Before that, I spent 3 years as the executive director of ROSA, the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance. So this was a public-private partnership between offshore wind developers and fishermen to look at kind of interaction between the industries and support good science. Work closely with regulators both at the state and federal level, the fishery management councils and others, addressing some of these issues related to offshore wind. And then there's a sister organization known as the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative, or the RWSC. The similar work to ROSA, but in the wildlife space. So they handle issues related to marine mammals, to seabirds, to sea turtles, to all the fuzzy critters that the wildlife people care about. There's also money coming from the offshore wind developers. So in that process, there's requirements for pre-construction, during construction, and post-construction surveying. So usually there's generally at least 5 years of research and monitoring that needs to be done at a site level. And so those offshore wind developers are turning to academics and consultants and to others to lead those monitoring projects. And so there's millions of dollars in research coming from the offshore wind developers themselves. That being said, we're rapidly seeing a challenge in the research workforce. So there's limited capacity in academia, in the state and federal fisheries scientists, and the private companies like the environmental consultants to do this work. I've seen instances where an RFP has been put out and they haven't had enough applicants because researchers are just at capacity. They can't take on any more projects. And so one thing that I've been doing in my role is really advocating. We hear a lot about offshore wind workforce. A lot of it's related to engineers and builders and things like that. But we also advocate for building the science workforce as well. So one thing is looking at ways that people can utilize their existing fishery science expertise in offshore wind. So if you ask Mike Frisk if 10 years ago he thought he'd be doing offshore wind research, I don't even know. There's several really established fishery scientists that have looked at how their career and their expertise can help some of these offshore wind studies. Excuse me. I think it's really important to think about how we can train students at all levels, all the way from high school to graduate, of looking at how their expertise and their research skills and their technical skills can be used to offshore wind. And looking at exposure to non-traditional career paths. So a lot of times in academia, you're an academic, you go to graduate school, and then you go in academia. But there are a lot of ways to go from there. We've heard from folks that have gone the regulatory pathway at the state and federal level, but there are a whole lot of other options as well too. And so thinking at people either entering the workforce, the scientific workforce of alternate career paths, kind of non-traditional career paths, or folks that are more established and maybe thinking, hey, maybe I want to do something else, or use my expertise a different way, and how that can be utilized to help build our workforce. And speaking of non-traditional career paths, if you had asked me 10, 15 years ago, when I was a field biologist, if I'd be doing what I was doing today, I would have had no idea. One, offshore wind it was there, but it was kind of quietly happening. It wasn't nearly at the level that it's at right now. Even when I started working in the offshore wind space I'm trying to think, it was 2016, when I started working offshore wind as a consultant. I worked with NYCAFS on their offshore wind master plan. I was kind of subject matter expert in fisheries on that. The conversation with kind of the public and with fishermen on wind was, if it happens. We're not supportive, but if it happens, we want to see X, Y, and Z. And I saw in that kind of 2-year period where I worked with the state of New York on the master plan, the conversation went from if it happens to when it happens. It was no longer a question of if it was going to happen anymore. And at the time, organizations that I worked for, ROSA and now RDC, they didn't exist. They've been formed in the past 3-4 years. to really tackle some of these challenges. So it's opened my own kind of career path to something that I never thought a direction that I would have gone a few years ago. So I want to talk a little bit about these regional nonprofits that have formed in the last couple of years. I mentioned Rosa, happy to talk about that. I apologize to the Frisk Lab. I think I was invited to talk because I had been the director of Rosa, and then I was like, sure, I'll talk, but I've changed careers. So I'm doing in the similar space, but I've shifted slightly away from fisheries and more into R&D, something that still I'm getting adjusted to. I've only been here for about a month, but so I want to talk about the R&D world, which is opening my eyes to more opportunities for fisheries as well too. So NowRDC was formed in 2018 through a competitive solicitation from the Department of Energy. So the DOE put out an RFP that was won by NYCERDA to create a nonprofit to basically do research administration for R&D grants, research and development grants. DOE provided initial $20.5 million of funding, and NYCERDA matched that. So the organization started with $41 million of R&D funding to distribute to support offshore wind. Since its formation, we've brought on 6, I think actually now 7 states, 11 offshore wind developers, and 9 other kind of different members that have joined this consortium. Our work is it's nationally focused. It's actually starting to be internationally focused as well, working on kind of funding, research, prioritization, R&D work to help deployment of offshore wind, to address the challenges and obstacles, to maximize economic and social benefits, and to support reducing the cost of offshore wind development in the U.S. So what NowRDC does is fund innovation that responds to kind of technical and supply chain barriers. It convenes networks, so kind of connecting technical experts to industry to figure out what their needs are, to research institutions, to developers, to supply chain companies, to utilities, all of these things, kind of bringing them together. And to help increase content from the U.S., things like, how can we support Jones Act and U.S. flag vessels and things like that, and job opportunities. I'm not going to go through our members and our board, just acknowledging it's pretty diverse. It's several states, including New York and New Jersey, offshore wind developers and other industry members, power companies and things like that as well. So it started off with this core funding in 2018. The states contribute another several $1 million kind of since then. And we've been able to run 3 competitive solicitations, 52 projects that have been awarded, including some to not necessarily a few in the fisheries space, but a lot to different institutions in the U.S. So there's been $34 million in grant funding plus some match, close to $10 million. So in the stage right now, we're kind of looking at what I call the 2.0 of the organization. Most of that initial $41 million has been allocated, so we're looking at ways we can work with the states and others to fund other kind of innovative research and development moving forward. So we do a lot of work that's related to kind of engineering and supply chain, things like that, things that are outside of my wheelhouse to a certain extent. People speak in technical languages I don't always understand, but it is really important, I think fundamentally, whether you are pro-wind, whether you're not so sure about wind, where you're kind of on the fence, I think the agreement is that we need good science, we need to lower the costs, we need to do responsible work and ways that we can support that. So our organization has funded some projects on environmental and conflicting use. About 10% of those projects have been in that space. And I'm not going to go into detail, but if you have that kind of, well, how does R&D relate to fisheries? I just wanted to give some of these examples. So some of them are related to things like, on the kind of coexistence, co-use side, things like radar interference and how we can mitigate that, things about wildlife monitoring, marine mammal monitoring, things like that. And we recently awarded a project on co-design solutions for floating wind with fishing communities. So how can you work with fishermen to adapt your engineering to help reduce conflicts with industry as these turbines are built. We're also looking at new projects and approaches. So we have a new solicitation that's likely going to come out later this year for around $4 to $8 million, half from the US, half from the UK. So looking at how can we partner with innovation in other countries to look at R&D and building partnerships between the US and the UK. This is backed by a lot of state funding as well too, here in the US. And we'll have different kind of tracks that come out of that. One of them will likely, although it's not certain, be related to some of this kind of environmental mitigation and co-use issues as well. And just to flag kind of some of the other ways that we approach kind of R&D and innovation, there's certain cases where the technical experts in the industry come together and they realize there's a specific project that would be really great to have more funding behind. In this case, there's a project that we're exploring now, looking at wake effects of turbines, more kind of atmospheric. Like, there's opportunities where folks can come together and say, this is a really important problem we need to address together, and how can we get some technical experts to work on this. There's other international projects that we're working on with the Danish government, for example, as well as a couple projects related to kind of tech innovation. So there's one that we're trying to pilot with Sea Ahead, which is based out of New England, on kind of demonstration projects connecting offshore wind startups with the offshore wind industry. And a few weeks ago, we just launched this Offshore Wind Innovation Hub in Brooklyn in partnership with Equinor, which is an offshore wind company, NYU, and the New York City Economic Development Commission, building basically a innovation hub in Brooklyn to bring technical experts into a place where they can kind of network with the offshore wind industry and others to look at tech innovation and how that we can move some of that forward. So in terms of opportunities for innovation in fisheries and offshore wind, I'm still kind of thinking about, okay, how can I apply my fisheries expertise to R&D, to wind innovation, things like that. And so there's things that have been coming up over the years. This is just a few examples, but I think the door is kind of wide open of where this can go. So things like, how can we look at non-extractive sampling techniques? A big challenge that's been happening in the last year or two is actually, we want to do good science, we want to do good research, we want to match kind of existing sampling techniques, but there's been a change from the regulatory side, and it's been really difficult for the researchers to get the permits to do the surveys they want to do. So projects have set up a plan, and they're going to do a 2-year trawl survey, and they're going to compare it to long-standing NIMS surveys or state surveys, and then they can't get the permits because of protected species issues. So it's caused some of the PIs to think about, okay, how can I innovate my project to look at different ways to maybe do some non-extractive sampling? So, looking at things like eDNA or acoustic telemetry or remote sensing or things like that to look at how that can be matched with kind of traditional fishery science methods to monitor these areas. So, can we build out some of these non-extractive sampling techniques? I've heard people talk about someday we'll be able to fly a drone offshore, take a water sample, come back, process that for eDNA, or can we instrument the turbine in certain ways to collect certain information? So how can we have some of these technology innovations to help change the way that we're sampling some of these things? Other things are related to kind of remote sensing or uncrewed monitoring methods. How can we do these technological advancements to get really great information without having to do the really expensive at-sea surveys to do some of this. There's a real push starting to bubble up about a need for data collection, data storage, and data accessibility. There's so much data that's being collected from an engineering standpoint, from an ecological standpoint, from an atmospheric standpoint, that needs to be better kind of compiled, collected, even from a data security standpoint. Are we housing it in the right place that we're making sure that all this information doesn't get lost? And so how can we kind of help improve those methods? And looking at ways we can think about co-design, co-use, coexistence. I think, Jim had some really great pictures of the ocean as a busy place, especially in this area, massive amounts of shipping. We're looking at building offshore wind. There's a really vibrant commercial and recreational fishing industry. There's talks of offshore aquaculture and all of these things. So how can we think about kind of co-use? And I gave that example of a co-design of an offshore wind site with fishermen to kind of reduce some of these conflicts. So how can we use R&D to help support some of these things? So I just wanted to come back for a minute, to my last slide and think about, how we can look at these opportunities. And I don't want to imply that there's plenty of money coming out for research. There's never enough, right? We scientists know there's always more things that you can do. And so there is a fair amount of money coming out for research, both kind of, traditional research and monitoring, ecological research, as well as R&D. But there's always more funding that's needed to really answer some of these big questions. And so with that, how can we use the really great expertise that we have in fishery science, the kind of next generation of fishery scientists that are coming up to really answer these tough questions and build our workforce? And how can we think about, you know, how we use our skills into this new industry? And again, you know, folks are really pro clean energy. Folks are really against it, and there's a whole smattering of folks right in the middle that are cautiously thinking, agreeing that climate change is an issue, is something that we need to address, that renewable energy is really important to addressing these goals, but also the pace at which renewable energy and offshore wind in particular is happening is hard to keep up with these days. So how can we make sure that we have the workforce to answer these really difficult challenges at the pace that we need to answer them? And so, you know, my goal is to help make sure that fisheries scientists are thinking about all these big challenges, thinking about this industry that you may not have even been aware how fast it's coming, and how we can really do evidence-based, good, well-designed studies to help support the process as this moves forward. So that's all I have. Thank you.